Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel and another video in my Ask an Archaeologist video series. Today I am interviewing Adam, who works in US Cultural Resource Management as an underwater archaeologist. So far on my channel, I have only interviewed terrestrial archaeologists, that is, people that work on sites based on land, and that includes myself. So I'm really excited today to talk to somebody and dive into how archaeology works in such a completely different environment than what I'm used to. Before we begin, don't forget to show your support to the channel by subscribing and hitting the bell notification button so you get notified when I put out new videos. Also, if you can go give me a like or a follow on Instagram, that is greatly appreciated. All right, guys, let's dig in. Welcome to the channel, Adam. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks for having me and everything.
We're going to jump right into our first question, though, which is what inspired you to study archaeology and history as your majors at university?
My parents, both of them were very involved with teaching me and my brother history throughout our education. Whenever we went on vacation, we were always going to like the historical sites. I remember the first time we came to Virginia, we had to hit up Williamsburg. It's also when my parents went for their honeymoon. So
Mm.
they were getting some nostalgia, and Tyler and I were getting some history and everything. And after that, I mean, like, so I grew up on, Indiana Jones, and
Mhm.
then it was actually 2003, and I know exactly what time of year it was, because it was when Pirates of the Caribbean came out. We were on the flight back home from Florida, and we were visiting when we first saw it. I was like, I really like pirates. And I was going into my freshman year of high school that year.
Mhm.
And so essentially, like, I really started getting into maritime history specifically, and everything kind of fell from there. And so by the time I got to university, I knew that I wanted to study anthropology. For your European viewers, archaeology is a subfield of anthropology here in the US. It's not a subfield of history like it is in Europe. And so I went to school for originally for anthropology and a minor in history, knowing that I wanted to go into underwater archaeology.
So how do you do that at school? Did you pick a program that was going to have stuff to do with underwater archaeology, or did you just have like a bit of more of a basic archaeology and anthropology program?
I went to the University of Michigan, the
Mhm.
Flint campus, and so what I ended up doing was it was just a basic anthropology program. The history program was same standard curriculum and everything like that. You don't get into like specializations until grad school.
Oh, okay, good to know. In your little email that you sent me with a bit of your background in it, you mentioned originally just kind of doing anthropology, but then you had a history class that you really wanted to take, and you ended up taking an extra year at school just so you could end up having the both as your double major. I'm really interested to know like what class that was.
I had one last class to finish out my anthropology major, and I would have
Mhm.
been done, graduate, and everything like that. But it was this at the same time as the special topics course from the history department. And something just at the back of my in my gut was telling me, you really, really want to take this course.
Mm.
And it was in public history. I don't do like public outreach or anything like that in my day to day. And so I have no idea why I was getting this gut feeling, but it was like, you really want to take this class. And so at that point, I had the history minor, but going and taking that class, it would have been two part-time semesters for me to change that into a major. And so it was like,
Mm.
yeah, I'll do a super senior year.
Fair enough. So you mentioned wanting to do underwater archaeology, and you can only do that at grad school. So am I correct in thinking that that's why you decided to go to grad school?
Yeah, yeah. It was pretty much already known when I started college that I was going to be applying for grad school. A big question was whether or not I was going to take a year or two off. But at that point in time, I really wasn't interested at all in doing terrestrial work as I was an undergrad and not necessarily focused on the long future. I just wanted to get school done with.
Mhm.
And so I ended up just going straight into graduate school
Where did you go to school?
to East Carolina University.
Oh, okay. And presumably at their maritime program.
Yep, yep.
Did you do any terrestrial archaeology or like field schools as a part of your undergrad?
I did do field school, but it was underwater archaeology.
Oh, okay.
It's actually one of the things that there's a couple of times I've given advice, and it's always to undergrads, and it's always like, even if you're interested in a specialization, whether it be underwater archaeology or like bioarchaeology
Egyptology or
or
something,
Egyptology.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I always tell them to get an undergraduate terrestrial field school. I didn't have any terrestrial experience when I graduated with my master's. And what I learned very quickly was it's hard to get a job if you don't know how to dig a hole as an
Mm.
archaeologist.
Mm. Delving a bit more into the underwater archaeology, I can confess I don't really know much about it. I know that you guys use grids and you have special pens and things for writing things down underwater. It usually involves diving, but I think based on some of the stuff you were telling me, there's also quite a bit of remote sensing as well. So can you explain to us a little bit more about the methodology of how underwater archaeology gets done? And then perhaps we can talk a bit more as well about the technology you use to do that.
Probably the best example is what I do from my day to day as a CRM archaeologist.
Hmm.
And that is number one, after you get a contract, you start doing a lot of background research, doing a lot of GIS, getting ready for the survey. Then you actually fly down for a survey. And the surveys are always going to start out as remote sensing to
Hmm.
begin with. Depending on the state or country you're working in, that might be a marine magnetometer, a side scan sonar, and a sub bottom profiler. And we can go into more about what those do in just a little bit.
Hmm.
Now, if after the survey, if you've processed everything and you don't see anything, awesome, great. Write up your report and you're done.
Yeah.
Even if you do find something, you got to write up your phase one report. And at that point, for example, if it's like a pipeline or a subsea cable, if they can't route around any of the shipwrecks that you might find or submerged sites, at that point, that's when you go into a phase two, where first you're just diving to, number one, see if it fits the criteria of being an archaeological site.
Hmm.
Here in the US, that's 50 years of age or older. For other countries who are signatories to UNESCO 2001, it's 100 years. And so it depends on where all you're at. But after you've determined from a couple of target dives that whether or not it is old enough to be eligible for recommendation in the National Register of Historic Places, for example, at that point, you have to do a much more intense kind of documentation of it in situ. One of the things you almost never see is us bringing shipwrecks up out of the water,
Hmm.
and we might excavate some artifacts or along a grid and everything, but you never see us raising ships anymore.
Why is that?
Part of the reason is for like wooden shipwrecks, especially the wood reaches the state of equilibrium with the sea where it's degrading, but not quickly. And it's the same thing for steel wrecks, but a little bit differently. That's why with wrecks like the Mary Rose and the Vasa in Europe, that's why they're constantly spraying those things down
Hmm.
with the peg material.
Hmm. Like I said, I've not done underwater archaeology, but a site that I was on once did find some, I think they were like prehistoric, like canoes or like dugout canoes.
Hmm.
And every time that we found something like that, we were just having to constantly spray it with water so that the wood wouldn't dry out. So I imagine it's kind of similar to that.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. So the standard tends to be a lot of survey work. And do you say that you excavate fairly often, or is that kind of like every once in a while?
I have excavated a shipwreck twice, and both times were in school.
All right. Okay.
So one of my old bosses, when he first started the underwater program at a different company, one of their first big projects was a massive excavation of a shipwreck off the east coast of the US. And so they do happen, but it's rare.
Because I imagine they're like much more expensive than a standard excavation as well, because of all the equipment and everything, that
Yeah.
the extra stuff that you have to have.
Hmm.
You also mentioned the differences in diving certifications or qualifications between the US and Europe. So I presume you're a certified diver.
Yeah, yeah.
So can you tell us a bit more about that?
I forget necessarily when it was. It may have been the 90s or early 2000s. But after OSHA kind of went into effect here in the States, there was a decision made that Some types of science require divers to be acting as scientists, not as commercial divers. More than recreational, less than commercial.
Hmm.
And so the American Academy of Underwater Sciences was created, AAUS, and they essentially developed this entire program that exempted scientific divers from OSHA requirements so that, I'm not having to get hard hat certified because I wouldn't be an archaeologist if I was that at that level of certifications. But you don't have those distinctions in Europe. It's either recreational or it's commercial. And so America has this kind of in between,
Hmm.
whereas Europe doesn't. Just as an aside, I actually had a project
Yeah.
in Puerto Rico. It was a British client, and they were asking a lot of questions regarding our dive program because they were expecting commercial divers.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, my only really experience with commercial divers is, well, in the UK. I know that we have maritime archaeology over here, but I've never really been involved in it. Is people that go down in the oil rigs. That's
Hmm.
the
Yeah,
only thing that I know about. So finishing grad school, you've got your certifications. You started working in CRM as an underwater archaeologist. How did you get your start doing that?
I'm not gonna lie, I got lucky with my networking,
Mm,
and I had an interview for a position at the first company I worked for. I didn't get the job then, but the head guy remembered me, and there were some terrestrial positions that came open, and he was like, "We need warm bodies on this project. You're gonna go dig some holes for a little bit, but then I'm gonna bring you down,
mm,
and you're gonna be back out on the boat surveying."
mhm.
And so that was actually the first time I ever worked terrestrial. And at that point, I needed anything.
Yeah.
So I was like, digging holes? Great. I'll learn how to do it.
And how did you find it?
Well, since starting, I've gotten quite a bit of terrestrial experience. There was a small gap in between my underwater years, where for about 3 years I was running terrestrial crews in Texas and Oklahoma,
Mhm,
Arkansas. I was really happy to get the terrestrial experience.
mhm,
It gave me experience running crews, and honestly, when I'm talking about submerged prehistoric sites, the knowledge that I got while doing that terrestrial work allows me to speak more confidently than
mhm.
other people, even in underwater archaeology, really can, because we're so specialized that if you didn't do terrestrial for quite a while, you're not necessarily going to understand the how the landscapes work for those kind of submerged pre-contact sites.
What kind of jobs are out there as an underwater archaeologist, or like how does that necessarily work as a career path?
You always have academia
Mhm,
for folks with PhDs. You have museum directors, archival researchers, and everything. The big one right now, though, is CRM because the US is definitely focusing on offshore wind. We kind of joke that we don't have to worry about job security for about the next 2 decades with how much development is going on.
mhm,
And BOEM just opened up the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They just opened up the West Coast for development as well. And so right now it's just like going bonkers with offshore wind, but you still have your day-to-day, kind of subsea cables. You have your bridge projects that
mhm,
is always going to need CRM archaeologists to run a
mhm.
survey for.
How does the legislation work around that? So I've interviewed other American terrestrial archaeologists who've talked about how it's if it's a federal land or a federally associated project, it's required that you have to bring archaeology in, but private land is up for grabs, I guess. It's up to the person who owns it. But obviously, they weren't really talking about how things go once you're off land and you're on sea.
So state bottomlands or waterways are owned by the state, and state waters extend 3 miles out typically. And so in Puerto Rico, I believe it's 9 miles off the coast. And I think in the Gulf, it's also extended, but I can't remember how far offshore. It might be 9 miles as well. But typically, it's 3 miles off the coast that state waters go to. And the Abandoned Shipwreck Act of 1988 established that states are the owners of the shipwrecks embedded within their territorial waters, essentially, because of the Abandoned Shipwreck Act and also the National Historic Preservation Act. If there's going to be any kind of bottom disturbing activities, whether that just be anchoring all the way up to, dredging for a sand fill, or in the case of bridges, putting in pilings, there's going to need to be an underwater archaeologist who runs a survey.
A little bit more about your job. What does your kind of like day to day look like? Is it a lot of diving, spending time in a boat, or is it mostly writing reports?
Depends on what stage of a project we're at. So for, offshore wind, mostly it's data review. Those are, big survey companies that
Mhm.
go out and collect that data. And then we process it to our standards for what we need. If we're the ones doing the survey on like say a bridge project, for example, at that point if it's mostly like 10 hours a day on a boat, and then you get back to the office, you write your report, you process your data. If you're on a dive project, you're diving 10, 12 hours a day and typically getting maybe anywhere from 2 to 4 dives in on that
Mhm.
during that day. We have a joke that we actually only maybe dive on a quarter of all the surveys that we run. So when I talk to people about underwater archaeology, they're always like, "Oh man, like you must have a great time just diving all the time." And it's like, no, actually don't get to do that as often as you think.
When you're on the boat, is it mostly like operating this equipment that you were talking about?
Yeah,
And would you say that you spend most of your time in the office, like doing research and writing reports, or most of your time on the boat?
I'm gonna say 50-50.
Okay. So you must have some pretty good sea legs then.
Yeah, I've never had to take Dramamine on a boat, knock on wood here.
Congratulations. Have you ever had to do some work in some pretty interesting weather?
My current boss, when I was first working with him at a different company, we had a project where we could see storm clouds on the horizon, and we I looked at him and was like, "Boss man, are we really going out?" And he's like, "Got to poke our heads out there." And so we get out there and we got maybe 5 foot waves coming through, and we're in a 20-foot boat.
Mhm.
And so that project was close to a national park. The national park had a dock. We tied up there, waited out the bad weather. We were cruising back in, having called the day, and one of our boat props slipped, and so we were limping back in on one engine. That was definitely the day where I learned, yeah, gotta keep that weather radio on at all times there.
Yeah, it's a completely different situation when you're out on the water than when you're on land. You've been working in CRM, I think you said, for about 7 years. Pretty well established in your career, I would say. What are your future aspirations with what you want to do?
I want to get my PhD someday, but in the meantime, it's still getting myself further entrenched as an established underwater archaeologist and getting a lot more projects under my name
Mhm.
throughout the US and with the company that I'm working with now, maybe even internationally.
You've mentioned traveling a bit, and that's actually something that a lot of my viewers come to the channel asking about is, do I get to be an archaeologist and travel the world and get to go and do lots of digs in all these different places? And a lot of the times my answer is, well, you can probably end up traveling around the country in which you're based in, but unless you're an academic, you don't get to travel internationally very often. And in the US, my impression was you get some people who do travel around the country, but there are some people that just work in a state. So how is that in underwater archaeology?
We're far more spread out.
Oh, okay.
We have to be able to do surveys throughout the country because we are so niche. We
Mm.
can have, kind of an area of specialization, but otherwise you got to be able to go
Oh,
wherever
okay.
there's a coastline.
Oh, good to know. So anybody who wants to do lots of traveling in archaeology, become an underwater archaeologist.
Yes, yes.
You've mentioned this technology that you guys use for a lot of your remote sensing. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and perhaps how it kind of works?
Yeah. One of the biggest pieces of equipment that we're going to use is a side scan sonar. And a side scan sonar is just going to be imaging the swaths of the seafloor.
Hmm.
and it gives you a 2D image. You also have multi-beam echo sounders that do the same thing, but they create a 3D image.
Mhm.
Those are slightly more complicated as far as technology, and so typically we're using a side scan sonar instead. We have a marine magnetometer that we use, which is a fancy metal detector that only detects iron and steel. But for some shipwrecks, since they're buried, you're not going to be able to see them in a side scan sonar.
Mm,
And that's what the mag is there to help us with.
mm,
And finally, the other big piece of equipment that we use is a sub-bottom profiler. We use those for submerged pre-contact sites that have been submerged since the last glacial maximum. They are essentially a marine version of a ground penetrating radar.
I know what that is. It gives me a good idea. So moving on to our next kind of finishing off segment, what is your best and worst field experiences?
The I actually just joked that project that I recently had in Puerto Rico was the most stressful one of my life. We started the project over Easter weekend. For most of America, yeah, Easter Sunday's a thing, but like
Mhm.
Good Friday and everything like that, it's not really a big holiday.
Mhm.
But in Puerto Rico, majority Catholic, we forgot that that is a big holiday
Thing.
in general. And it's the entire weekend. And so equipment wasn't wanting to work. And on top of that, most places were closed while we were trying to get this project done, because that one was actually one where we knew we were going to be diving. We were trying to get the survey done before all the diving, and nothing was just working for that entire weekend. And it was just the most stressful thing in my life. I had a client rep on board, and it was just like, I just want to get this done so bad. Best project,
Or best experience, like your best
best
story
experience.
that, when you were having that experience, you were like, yes, this is archaeology, this is what I want to do, or like this really validated that you wanted to do it.
I'd have to say the first field school I went on.
Mhm.
Um, it was a small little mid 1800 shipwreck in Bermuda. We were diving on it for 2 weeks straight. That was one of them that we did excavation on. And it was like clear water. It was doing exactly what I thought I'd be doing for all this. And so that was 2010 when I did that field school. And so since then, it's just been like full bore underwater archaeology. I flew back and my dad was picking me up from the airport and he was like, "So this is really what you want to do?" Yeah. Uh-huh.
What is your favorite thing that you've discovered or found on an archaeological site?
For that, I'm going to have to go with one of my terrestrial projects. So we were working in Arkansas right on the, I believe it was the Arkansas River. We knew that there was a previously recorded site just outside of our survey area. We were doing our shovel testing as the contract told us to. But since the previously recorded site really wasn't in our area, I wasn't paying too much attention to it. It ended up extending into our area. We ended up finding, I think, something like 700 artifacts in this thing. And most of it was at the surface too. I mean, this was a real shallow site, but they just had never looked in the area where we were surveying.
Mhm.
And this thing just, I think I added 13 acres to the site. It was, yeah, 700 some artifacts. And I think we ended up putting in like 219 shovel tests or something like that. It was a
Wow.
massive site.
Yeah, no kidding. Next, we actually have a new question that I've added to my list of things. So I was kind of thinking about how, everyone tends to have either that site or that historical figure or something like that who inspired them for archaeology, or they're thinking like, oh, if I could find Cleopatra's tomb, that would be like my ultimate thing or
Mhm.
or project that I'd want to work on. So in that vein, what is your dream site, shipwreck, or artifact that you'd like to
Oh
work on,
man.
work with, or find?
So I really like doing research on like everyday vessels. So I have one paper with my former advisor where we talk about everyday schooners in North Carolina. I love doing background research on your run-of-the-mill kind of sidewheel steamers up in the Northeast. And so I think finding like just one of those nondescript, you might not even know the name of it, but just like a really intact sidewheel steamer that just represents, like the everyman kind of vessel of the marine world.
Mhm. That's a really interesting answer. Wrapping things up now, you spoke a little bit about what you talking to students and telling them what to do, but do you want to elaborate a little bit more and on what kind of things you would say to people that you want to encourage or inspire to follow in your footsteps?
Take a terrestrial field school. Um, if you want to specialize, that's what grad school is for, and grad school is going to be there. Get your basics down, and don't be afraid to take a year off to get some experience, because that's only going to look better to a grad school and actually show, oh yeah, you're actually serious about wanting to do this.
Mhm.
I would also say a lot of GIS. I think I work in GIS most days that I'm in the office. If you do actually go to school for underwater archaeology, don't focus solely on diving. I think I'm only certified up to rescue diver. Like I'm
Mhm.
not a dive master or tech diver or anything like that. But what's going to look even better and what we're actually having kind of a shortage in the field right now with is people who can run a remote sensing survey, people who know how to operate and process
Mhm.
magnetometer, side scan sonar, and sub bottom profiler data.
Very interesting how much those kind of like computer software skills are now being really integrated into archaeology
Hmm.
with all of the remote sensing and geophysics and
It
stuff,
really
and
is
how
because
much that's coming
it
in.
yeah, it's no longer just, like there's a shipwreck, let's go diving. No, you
Mhm.
actually have to understand how to look for one. And you got to understand what it looks like in the data because some shipwrecks don't look like shipwrecks when you see
Mm.
them in the data.
Tying everything off for today, you mentioned that you don't really have social media for people to follow you to see what you're at, but do you have any resources or anything that you can recommend to people who are interested in underwater archaeology and seeing what it's like?
There's East Carolina University's program Maritime Studies. Their website is typically updated fairly often with the different projects that are going on there. You also have Texas A&M University's websites, and I know that their conservation lab has been doing a lot of big projects with the World Trade Center wreck that they
Mm.
found, and also some of the stuff in Alexandria, Virginia. And then Wisconsin Historical Society always has new wrecks that they have documented, and they have recently found a couple of prehistoric canoes that they are undergoing conservation. But yeah, there's so many different volunteer organizations as well that
Mhm.
people just need to, seek out and get involved with.
Well, that wraps everything up for today. So thanks for coming on and really interesting to learn all these different things. I think that's a pretty good spot to end it at. So
Okay.
we'll finish off with that today. Okay, that's it for Adam's interview today, guys. What did you think? Did you learn something new? Are you now inspired to become an underwater archaeologist to fulfill all your travel dreams? Let me know in the comments down below. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up to help us out with the algorithm and to let me know that you want to see more videos like this. If you want to see more from me, subscribe and hit the bell button so you get notified whenever I put out new videos. Also, you can check me out on Instagram. I post lots of extra content there that doesn't necessarily make it onto YouTube. All of the links and lots of resources that Adam has sent me about underwater archaeology and finding stuff out about it are all in the description down below if you're interested. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.